There is a standard explanation for why grand public buildings from the 1800s look the way they do. Wealth, ambition, civic pride. Governments and private institutions, the story goes, wanted to project permanence. They hired the best architects available, imported stone from quarries hundreds of miles away, and invested decades into construction. The results: train stations, courthouses, exhibition halls, municipal libraries, were impressive by design. Meant to be. That explanation is reasonable. It is the one taught in architectural history courses. It accounts for most of what we see. Until you start measuring. Not impressions. Not aesthetics. Actual measurements. Ceiling heights. Column diameters. Entrance widths. Load-bearing ratios relative to the stated population of the city at the time of construction. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. But the numbers are worth examining. Take a mid-sized American city in 1870. Population, roughly 40,000 people. A new federal building is completed that year, a post office and courthouse combined. Standard civic infrastructure for a growing settlement. The entrance hall alone is 62 feet high. Not the main dome. Not a ceremonial rotunda added decades later. The entrance hall. The functional space where clerks processed mail and citizens filed papers. 62 feet. For context, that is taller than a modern 6-story office building. In a city of 40,000 people. Built before the population had reached numbers that might justify that scale, and before the city had any particular expectation of becoming a regional center. The official record describes it as forward-thinking civic architecture. A building designed for the city's future, not its present. That interpretation exists. It is documented. But the pattern does not appear in isolation. And that is where the examination begins. Across the northeastern United States, across portions of Western Europe, and in scattered examples through South Asia and North Africa, a specific type of interior spatial proportion appears in buildings officially dated to the early to mid-19th century. Not decorative grandeur. Structural scale. Rooms where the ceiling height exceeds the functional requirement by a factor of 2, sometimes 3. Corridors wide enough to accommodate the population of an entire city block moving simultaneously. Stairwells with risers and treads proportioned. Architects have noted this specifically, for a slightly taller average human stride than the one documented for the populations of the time. Each of these observations has an individual explanation. High ceilings improved ventilation before modern HVAC. Wide corridors allowed for fire safety and crowd flow. Proportional decisions were often made by architects trained in classical traditions that prioritized aesthetic harmony over practical efficiency. These explanations are credible. The question is not whether each one holds. It is whether all of them, applied simultaneously, consistently, across dozens of buildings in unconnected cities, built by different architects, funded by different governments, over the span of a single generation, points to something more systematic than coincidence. Look at the materials. Structural iron was available in limited quantities in the early 1800s. Large-scale steel production, the kind that would make it economically viable for routine construction, did not arrive until the latter half of the century. And yet, the internal iron frameworks found in several buildings officially dated to the 1840s and 1850s show fabrication techniques and consistency of cross-section that some structural historians have described as technically advanced relative to the manufacturing capacity of the period. One engineering survey of a European municipal hall, published in a peer-reviewed architectural history journal in 2011, noted that the uniformity of the cast iron columns throughout the structure, in terms of diameter tolerance, surface treatment, and load distribution geometry, was consistent with industrial fabrication standards more typical of the 1880s or 1890s. The building's official date of completion, 1851. The researchers proposed several interpretations. A highly skilled local foundry. Imported components from a more industrially advanced region. Or, and this was offered with appropriate caution, a possibility of dating error in the original archival record. No conclusion was reached. There is a specific type of room that appears repeatedly in buildings of this period. It has no universally agreed name. Architectural historians sometimes call it a great hall, sometimes a receiving room, sometimes simply a primary interior space. It is characterized by the following consistent features: ceiling height of no less than 30 feet in the smallest examples, lateral dimensions that create a sense of open horizontal expanse before vertical height, acoustic properties that allow unamplified speech to carry clearly to the far wall, and, critically, proportions that appear to be based on a consistent internal ratio rather than derived from exterior building constraints. In simpler terms, these rooms feel designed from the inside out. The interior spatial logic comes first. The exterior shell follows. This is not how most 19th century institutional buildings are described as having been constructed. The standard documented approach of the period was exterior first, establish the footprint, determine the facade, then fit interior spaces to remaining dimensions. These rooms suggest a different sequence. Whether that points to a different design tradition, a different era of construction, or simply a different and underdocumented class of architect, that question remains open in the literature. Scale, proportion, and spatial logic. These are not romantic concepts. They are measurable. They produce data. And data, when it clusters in unexpected ways around a specific historical window, invites examination. The buildings are still standing. Many of them are in use today, as government offices, libraries, museums, repurposed commercial spaces. Millions of people walk through them annually and experience the same physical sensation, a sense of space that seems to exceed what the building, or the era, or the city should have needed. Most people attribute it to craftsmanship. Some researchers attribute it to intentional overbuilding. A smaller number of analysts, working across architectural history, materials science, and urban development records, have begun asking a more uncomfortable question, not about the buildings themselves, but about the system that produced them. Who was building at this scale? For whom? And by what organizational capacity? The records that survive describe the builders we know. But some of the rooms suggest a builder we have not fully accounted for. The pattern, once you begin looking for it, does not stay contained to a single country. That is the first thing to understand. If this were an American phenomenon, a product of post-colonial overconfidence, of a young nation building beyond its means to project stability, it would be explainable within a familiar historical framework. Nations do that. Rome did it. The British Empire did it. Overbuilding as soft power is a documented strategy. But the pattern does not respect national borders. It does not follow trade routes in the expected direction. It does not concentrate in capital cities and thin out toward the periphery, which is what you would expect if prestige-driven construction were driving the scale. It appears in peripheries first. Sometimes only in peripheries. That is the detail worth holding. In the United Kingdom, the municipal building programs of the 1830s through 1860s are well documented. This was the era of civic expansion: new town halls, new exchanges, new covered markets, new public baths. The Industrial Revolution had generated wealth. Populations were consolidating in urban centers. The construction made sense. What is less frequently discussed is the spatial profile of buildings in secondary industrial towns. Not London, not Manchester in its peak years, but places like Rochdale, Huddersfield, Halifax. These were working towns. Functional, productive, and by the standards of the time, economically significant but not architecturally ambitious. Their town halls tell a different story. Rochdale Town Hall, completed in 1866, contains an interior great hall with a ceiling height of approximately 70 feet. The town's population at the time of its completion was under 30,000. The hall was designed for civic gatherings, public meetings, official ceremonies. The acoustic design of the space can support unamplified speech to an audience of several thousand. Rochdale in 1866 did not have several thousand people who regularly attended civic gatherings of any kind. The standard explanation, civic ambition, regional pride, the influence of the Gothic revival movement which encouraged vertical extravagance. These are documented factors. But the consistency of this overpreparation, the fact that it appears not in one aspirational town but across a dozen functionally similar towns in the same decade, suggests something more systemic than individual architectural enthusiasm. In the United States, the pattern takes a specific form that has attracted the attention of a small number of urban historians. Between approximately 1850 and 1880, a category of federal building was constructed in cities across the expanding interior of the country. Post offices, custom houses, federal courthouses. Many of these cities were, at the time of construction, modest settlements. Some had populations under 20,000. The buildings were not modest. Custom houses are a particularly striking example. A custom house, functionally, is an administrative facility for processing import and export documentation. Its operational requirements are straightforward: office space, storage, processing areas, waiting rooms. The custom houses built during this period in American cities routinely feature entrance halls that exceed 50 feet in height, interior rotundas with load-bearing masonry of a complexity that structural engineers today describe as technically demanding even by modern standards, and floor plans with corridor widths that would accommodate, simultaneously, far more human traffic than the city's commercial volume could have plausibly generated. The custom house in Galveston, Texas, a city that, at the time of the building's construction in the 1850s, was significant as a port but not exceptional in population, contains interior stonework with a consistency of jointing and surface finish that one architectural survey described as indicative of either an unusually skilled local workforce with no documented record of its existence, or prefabricated components of undetermined origin. Both possibilities are in the published literature. Neither has been fully resolved. There is a word that architectural historians use when they encounter this spatial profile: overbuilt. It is a neutral term. It means the structure exceeds the functional demands of its context. It carries no implication of error or waste. Overbuilding can be intentional, strategic, even visionary. But when overbuilding appears systematically, across unconnected cities, in the same structural vocabulary, within the same compressed historical window, the term begins to strain under its own neutrality. Because overbuilding implies a builder who knew, at the moment of construction, that the space would eventually be needed. Or a builder operating to a standard that was not derived from local need at all. The second possibility is the one that existing frameworks have the most difficulty accommodating. Consider the infrastructure relationship more carefully. Standard urban development follows a recognizable sequence. Population grows, demand increases, infrastructure responds. Roads widen because traffic demands it. Buildings expand because populations require it. The built environment is, in this model, always slightly behind human need, catching up, adjusting, scaling to meet a reality that precedes it. What the buildings of this period suggest, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in comparable examples found in France, Germany, and parts of the Austro-Hungarian administrative territories, is an inversion of that sequence. The infrastructure preceded the demand. Not by years. In several documented cases, by decades. Train stations completed in the 1850s with platform configurations capable of handling passenger volumes that the city did not reach until the 1890s. Market halls built with vendor capacity for commercial activity that outpaced local production by a factor of 3 for the first 15 years of operation. Administrative buildings with filing and processing infrastructure, physical infrastructure, not staffing, scaled for a bureaucratic workload that the city's population could not have generated until a generation after construction. Each case has a localized explanation. The cumulative pattern does not. Some researchers working in this area, historians, architectural analysts, a smaller number of material scientists, have noted that when they attempt to account for all of these overlapping anomalies within the standard framework of 19th century construction, they encounter a consistent gap. Not a single missing piece. A structural gap in the explanatory model itself. The tools documented in the period do not fully account for the precision observed. The workforce records do not fully account for the speed of construction. The economic records do not fully account for the funding at the scale required. And the population data does not account for the spatial decisions made. These gaps exist independently. Individually, Each one is manageable. There are always archival lacunae, always underdocumented local industries, always unexplained efficiencies. But some researchers have begun to ask whether these gaps are independent at all, or whether they share a common origin that existing categories have not yet successfully named. There is, it turns out, a label that a growing number of analysts, some working in serious historical contexts, others operating at the edges of accepted scholarship, have begun applying to this cluster of observations. It is a term with a complicated history of its own. And understanding what it actually refers to, stripped of the associations it has accumulated, requires starting from a different place than most people expect. The word is Tartaria. It appears on maps. Old ones, officially produced, institutionally sanctioned maps, printed by European cartographic houses throughout the 16th, 17th, and into the 18th century. On these maps, a territory labeled Tartaria, or Tartary, occupies a vast expanse of the Eurasian landmass. In some editions, it stretches from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific coast. In others, it is subdivided, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary, Independent Tartary, suggesting not a monolithic entity but a recognized geographic and administrative region that European mapmakers considered significant enough to name, repeatedly, across 2 centuries of cartographic production. This is not fringe material. These maps are held in national archives. They are catalogued in university libraries. They are studied by historians of cartography as legitimate primary sources for understanding how early modern Europe conceptualized the world beyond its direct administrative reach. The question that some researchers have begun asking, carefully, with appropriate qualification, is whether this label, which clearly referred to something real enough to appear on official maps for 200 years, might also provide a partial interpretive framework for the architectural patterns examined earlier. That is a significant step. It requires precision. First, what the label does not mean, at least not in the interpretation that serious researchers apply to it. Tartaria, in the historical record, is not a hidden empire. It is not a suppressed civilization. It is not a unified political entity whose memory was deliberately erased. The cartographic record itself argues against that reading. You do not place something on 2 centuries of official maps and simultaneously erase it. What the label does appear to represent, in the most cautious scholarly interpretation, is a recognition, by European mapmakers working from traveler accounts, diplomatic correspondence, and trade records, that a large portion of the Eurasian interior was organized in ways that did not map cleanly onto the European political categories of the time. Not a kingdom. Not an empire in the Western sense. Something else, a distributed network of administrative and cultural organization that was real enough to name but resistant to precise definition. One interpretation holds that the architectural consistency observed across 19th-century buildings in Europe and North America, the shared spatial vocabulary, the overbuilt scale, the infrastructure preceding demand, may reflect the tail end of a building tradition whose origins predate the national contexts in which the buildings now sit. Not construction by a foreign power. Not occupation or imposition. Something subtler, the persistence of a design standard, transmitted through channels that the surviving documentary record does not fully capture. There is a parallel in how historians treat other forms of cultural transmission. Musical scales. Structural engineering ratios. Agricultural techniques. Metallurgical processes. These have all been documented moving across vast geographic distances in the pre-modern world through routes that were not formal diplomatic or commercial channels, through migration, through craft traditions passed between generations, through the movement of skilled workers who left no written record of their transit. The buildings of the period in question may represent a similar transmission. If the spatial proportions, the acoustic designs, the material standards, and the infrastructural scale all share a common origin, not in any single national tradition, but in a broader organizational framework that operated across regions, then the label Tartaria, stripped of its sensationalized associations, becomes something more like a placeholder. A name for a gap in the explanatory record. Not an answer. A marker for a question that the existing framework has not yet closed. This interpretation is contested. It is important to say that clearly. Mainstream architectural historians, by and large, do not find the Tartaria framework necessary or productive. The standard account, civic ambition, classical revival traditions, industrial wealth driving overbuilding, skilled labor imported from established European centers, is, in their assessment, sufficient to explain what the buildings show. The gaps identified by researchers working in the alternative framework are, in this view, artifacts of incomplete archival work rather than evidence of a missing organizational layer. Foundry records that seem inconsistent with the period are explained by underdocumented regional industries. Construction timelines that seem compressed are explained by workforce size estimates drawn from incomplete census data. Spatial decisions that seem disproportionate to local population are explained by forward planning philosophies documented in the correspondence of individual architects. These are not weak arguments. They are grounded in verifiable sources. The disagreement is not between evidence and speculation. It is between two different readings of the same incomplete record, one that finds the gaps explainable within existing categories, and one that finds the pattern of gaps itself worth examining as data. What makes the Tartaria label particularly difficult to evaluate is the noise surrounding it. In online spaces, the term has accumulated layers of interpretation that serious researchers find unhelpful: claims of deliberate suppression, of civilizational erasure, of coordinated historical falsification. These claims are not supported by the cartographic or architectural record. If anything, the visibility of the Tartaria label across centuries of official European mapping argues against any systematic campaign to remove it from public knowledge. But the noise has made it harder to examine the underlying question cleanly. Some researchers who find the architectural patterns genuinely anomalous have begun avoiding the label precisely because of its associations, preferring to discuss the spatial and material evidence on its own terms, without the interpretive baggage that the word now carries in popular discourse. That is, perhaps, its own kind of distortion. The buildings remain. They do not require a label to be measurable. The ceiling heights are documented. The material analyses are published. The infrastructure to population ratios are calculable from census and construction records that anyone can access. What requires a label, or at least requires a decision about how to think, is the pattern. Because patterns are interpretive objects. They do not announce their own meaning. A cluster of anomalies in the historical record can mean that the record is incomplete in ordinary ways. It can mean that the explanatory framework being applied is too narrow. It can mean that something occurred which the surviving documentation does not fully capture. All three possibilities are live. None of them is closed. What we are left with, at the end of this examination, is not a revelation. It is not a correction of the historical record. It is something more uncomfortable than either of those things. It is a set of rooms. Rooms that are larger than they needed to be. Built with a precision that sits at the edge of what the documented technology of the period should have produced. Organized according to spatial logics that feel internally consistent in ways that exceed their official contexts. And distributed, with a consistency that resists coincidence, across cities that had no documented reason to share a building tradition. The rooms are still there. You can stand in them. And standing in them, measuring the distance from floor to ceiling, feeling the way sound moves across the space, noticing the way the proportions resolve into something that feels, without quite being explainable, exactly right. The question that surfaces is not who built them. It is what they already knew.